If you've been following along in the video series so far in your own code, you've probably made a mistake or two. I know I did. Most of the time, the kind of mistakes you make are easily spotted because the editor can help you detect the problem. If we forget a square bracket, there's a little red squiggle there telling you that what you just wrote here is not valid JavaScript. So it's easy to just put it back and try to balance the parentheses. But there are some more subtle errors that can creep in, like misspellings. Like, for instance, let's say we wanted to have style color red here, except we misspell color. This is fully valid JavaScript, but it's not doing what we expected. It's easy for us to see now that we made a mistake, but what if we were a little hasty in editing a component that wasn't currently visible on screen? We might forget about this and we'd have some junk code left around. Even more confusing sometimes, we forgot about a square bracket. That means it's a JavaScript error and we try to fix it by correcting like this. Now part of the footer is just invisible, and we might try figuring out why by digging into the filters menu function and seeing why isn't it rendering, and we'd be completely wrong about it, and the editor isn't able to give us any help here. Even worse, sometimes, let's say we forget that we need to wrap strings that we want rendered as text nodes in the text component. We just put the string in like this. Now Hyperapp just breaks on that because it doesn't know what to do with a string. But the error message we get in the browser isn't helpful at all. And let's say we were using, instead of the header function there, we were using the built-in h function in some places, like here for instance. And let's say we forget that the properties object is mandatory when using h. What happens then? Well, the error message actually changed, but it's still completely unhelpful. So if all we see is an error message here and we say, oh, we need to add the props object. Oh, nope, there's still an error. Maybe that wasn't it. And we'd be confused about what we need to do next. All of these problems occur because while the editor is able to tell us what is valid and invalid JavaScript, it doesn't know about how these functions that Hyperapp exports are meant to be used, so it can't tell us when we're using them wrong. And that's because Hyperapp doesn't yet have type definitions. When Hyperapp gets official type definitions, Visual Studio Code would be able to help us a lot more. In the meanwhile, you can simply install some type definitions of your own for Hyperapp to get the same helpfulness. I've created some type definitions you could use. You can download them from the linked assets to this video. They're by no means perfect, but they will help you quite a bit. So, to bring in type definitions for Hyperapp, we're going to make a new folder, and we're going to call it types. And we're going to create two files in here, hyperapp.dts, the extension for a declaration file, and another one called Hyperapp HTML.dts. And then we're going to copy paste this code over that I have prepared here, and again you can download it from the linked assets. And now, because Visual Studio Code doesn't know that we installed these types, we need to tell it by adding a jsconfig.json file. It just needs to contain the rule that it's supposed to check for JS, and that it should include all JavaScript files as well as the type definition files. There. Okay, now we're seeing some squiggles here telling us we have some errors. First of all, this stuff up here wasn't wrong before. We didn't change any of it, so why is it telling us there's an error here? We're going to look at that later, but for now I'm just going to show you what to do when TypeScript thinks that something is wrong with your code when you know that it isn't. You can simply say ts-ignore, and we'll just put that above every line that has an error that we think shouldn't be an error for now. These two places we were messing around with, so the errors here are probably real. The error messages aren't super helpful. It can be kind of hard to work out what the problem is here. Basically, it's saying here that we are trying to use a virtual element as a properties object, which makes sense when you think about it. we're using a virtual element in the place of a property object. So that tells us, okay, we can put the property object back. And we still got a squiggle here, and that's because it says we're trying to use a string as a property object. And of course that doesn't make sense either. So then we figure out that, we forgot to make it into a virtual element. And now it can see that this is correct. What about here? It's expecting 0 to 2 arguments, but it got 4. Okay, that helps us understand that, okay, we were supposed to wrap these in square brackets. And now it's even able to tell us that the style property should have style keys, and this is not a proper style key, so we can correct the spelling there. And now everything works again. Now it's a bit of a bummer that we need to have these ts_ignore things here just to shut the type checker up. It would be nice if it could figure out that this is correct. This is kind of subtle, and it's a weird thing about TypeScript, but if you're gonna use TypeScript with Hyperapp, it's a good thing to know about. So here it's saying that we are trying to assign some array of arbitrary length where the elements could be either this function or this object type. But it's expecting us to give it a subscription. So let's look in the definition at a subscription. A subscription is a tuple like this, so using the array square brackets, with exactly 2 elements, and the first one is a subscription controller function, and the other one is the options object. Let's look at what we're providing from persister. Yeah, that's exactly what we're giving it. Why can't it figure it out? Well, for some reason, when you're giving the array with plain JavaScript and no type annotations, TypeScript has to assume that it is a arbitrary length array. So what we can do is we can actually add type annotations right here, but we don't need to write using TypeScript syntax, so we don't need to pass this through a compiler or anything. We can just write it using the jsdoc syntax of type annotations, which means that the code is still fully runnable in a browser without any processing. And the syntax for that is you say it's at type, and then you have curly brackets wherein you define the type of the thing that will follow. And the thing that's going to follow is going to be some function that is going to return. We don't need to get into any of the specifics at this point. All we need to do is tell TypeScript that it's going to be exactly 2 items in this tuple, and that way it'll be able to figure everything else out. We also need to say that it could have this function could have any number of arguments of any kind. There. Should we have a look and see how that looks? It removed the squiggle from persister, but all the other things in this file return tuples like that. So let's just put that type annotation on each of them. And now all the errors are gone. Now we have another interesting thing, which is that because all the errors are gone, TypeScript and Visual Studio Code are now able to infer what the value of state will be passed in here. Before, all it could assume is that state here could be any value because it didn't know how we'd be using the other arguments to app. Now it knows that this first thing here is going to be, it's the same type of things that will be passed in as this argument here. So that means, let's say before we had state editing, and we wouldn't have gotten an error. Now it'll tell us there's no such thing as editing on the state value. And so we could say, why not? What do we have? Oh, we have a list, and list has editing. Okay, cool.